One technology as a concept. In my early studies on technology, I employed this term as a concept without explaining it, thereby giving rise to countless misunderstandings. The technologies used in all possible domains, so I felt, had enough common features for us to deduce a general concept. It is common knowledge that, while nobody has ever seen the dog, we can still find enough common traits in a spaniel, boxer, Great Dane, Pekingese, Pinscher despite all the differences to understand one another perfectly when we use the word dog. I certainly do not want to get into the quarrel of the universals, nor will I claim that in some empyrean there is a concrete idea per se of absolute technology. But I do claim that, scientifically, I can construct a phenomenon from the features of, and the interrelations between, the phenomena generally known as technological in our society. For this society in which technology has become dominant is the first to have the concept of technology. Certain people now declare that technology does not exist and that they know only plural technologies. Such a notion, however, comes from a shallow sense of realism and is obviously unsystematic. Technology as a concept allows us to understand a set of phenomena that remain invisible even where technologies are perceptibly manifest. But while the concept may be indispensable for comprehension, it is by no means clear and simple in itself. Nor does it imply the existence of a technological system. We will not recur to the problem of defining technology, but we are going to examine the genesis of this concept in reference to modern reality. The terms technique and technology cover a large number of phenomena and have several meanings. The difficulty is that these meanings refer to various realities: concrete realities, the technology of the internal combustion engine, objects of scientific study, and finally strata of diversified technologies in time. Originally, it seems, people spoke of technique, which, consistent with its etymology, meant a certain manner of doing something, a process or ensemble of processes. Diderot thus speaks of the technique proper to each painter. But rapidly, as the machine and its industrial application came to dominate, technique, and then technology in English, began to designate the processes of constructing and exploiting machines. People now more frequently employed the plural. These were then studied by a science called technology in French and technology in English. While English uses technology for both the science and its object of study, French distinguishes respectively between technology and technique. Trans note. This science consists in describing and analyzing these techniques, French, i.e., technologies English, in tracing their history and investigating ways of improving them. At the end of the 19th century, the science of technology was divided into 5 branches, which is quite indicative of what was then known as technique or technology. These 5 branches were raw materials, processes and machines bearing upon the home plus clothes and food, hygiene and health, light and heat, tools and instruments. Scientists soon distinguished between instruments and energy sources. The classification of technologies was now by tools and instruments, machines, apparatuses. Tools and instruments are material systems for increasing the efficiency of human action. Notably, they give man access to phenomena with an intensity that is too weak to act directly upon the senses, measuring instruments, or else they multiply the intensity of his efforts. From a technological viewpoint, these tools and instruments have the characteristic of being directly operated by man. Machines are material systems replacing man for actions he cannot perform himself, most often because they require too much energy. Finally, the ambiguous term apparatus designates both complex instruments and machines using a small amount of energy. Naturally, each area combines several tools, machines, and instruments in order to perform an operation correctly. Thus, the division of labor multiplies the number of technologies, which themselves produce machines. Hence, technology was seen no longer as a parceling operation, but as a set of inanimate or exceptionally animate beings, organized to replace man in performing a set of operations defined by man. Louis Coufignol, Théorie de l'efficacité de l'action. Technology thus has 2 new features. It no longer relates to just an aspect, an action, but to a whole, a set, an ensemble. It refers above all to machines that tend to replace man. And among these machines, one distinguishes those that furnish energy, those that utilize energy, power machines replacing man in his processing of material, and those involved in information, operational machines replacing man in his operations of creating, transforming, or transmitting information. 12. On this level, technology scarcely refers to industrial operations. The stages of technology are readily compared to the stages of industrial growth. These stages are dictated by energy production. Observers thus speak of the first industrial revolution, characterized by the use of coal as a power source, and by the machines built to use coal. Then came a second industrial revolution, characterized by electricity. The third one causes some wavering, the use of atomic energy. But for several years now, people have been speaking of a fourth industrial revolution, the one launched by the computer. It is obvious that we are now switching gears, for this is no longer a change or advance in power sources. The dominant factor is no longer a growth of potential or exploited energy, but rather an apparatus of organization, information, memorization, and preparation for decision-making, to replace man in a huge number of intellectual operations. We can see that all the above stages are linked to the use of machines and specific technologies, but technology is then viewed as a reality that is independent of more or less improved practices and of machines. Technology as a whole has a general character in relation to individual technologies, but it does not leave the area of machine application. Nevertheless, a new meaning soon appeared. It became more and more obvious that these technologies and machines had vast consequences for human behavior and societal organization. People now began speaking of the technological society, Georges Friedman, Société technicien. Using technology, in a wider sense, they began studying the machine not only in itself, but also in its relations to man and society. We will not examine here this social science of technology studied as the industrial society. Nevertheless, at that time 20 years ago, the term technology was limited to the strict meaning of a scientific study of technological processes with no reference to sociological dimensions. For the latter, people spoke of a sociology of the machine or of technology. However, a new concept was already emerging. On the one hand, technology could apparently be defined very broadly in terms of what had implicitly been its overriding feature since its origins: efficiency. People could now say that technology was the ensemble of the absolutely most efficient means at a given moment. This allowed unhooking technology from the machine, for there were so many other technologies than those coupled to machines, for instance, sport technologies. Moreover, this definition had a great advantage. It reminded us that technology was made up of means, all means, but that we could focus only on those regarded as the most efficient at any moment, because that was the very criterion of choice and progress in the technologies. In other words, wherever there is research and application of new means as a criterion of efficiency, one can say that there is a technology. The latter is not defined by the instruments used or by some area of action, clothing, transportation, etc. There are perfectly abstract technologies, for example, speed reading. Yet the same word was employed to designate the parcellary, mechanical technologies and technology in that latter sense. Americans waver among techniques, technique, and technology. They frequently employ technology for what the French call technique in the general sense that we have just defined, rather than for the science of mechanical techniques, as in French. But this word did not achieve a varied gamut corresponding to the diversification and complexification of the phenomenon itself. Scholars observe that individual technologies, applied to different domains, react upon one another, which makes it impossible to study them separately. On the other hand, technologies were becoming more and more numerous, gradually encroaching upon the whole field of human activity. They took on a new consistency because of their very number and density. Finally, these two factors were joined by the computer. The data processor is an element of connection, of coordination among a huge number of technologies, just as in itself it is the product of diverse technologies conjoined. People thus came to a new conception of technology as an environment and as a system. That is to say, the combined technologies affecting the totality of human actions and lifestyles took on a qualitatively different importance. Technology was no longer an addition of techniques. By combining and universalizing, observers had now given it a kind of autonomy and specificity. This is the point we have reached in the domains of both accomplished and established facts, ergo, of scientific analysis. This analysis is hard enough and risky enough for the social science of technology, the study of its effects on human groups. But it is even more difficult and hazardous for the study of technology as an all-inclusive and all-including system and reality. Yet when we try to formulate the concept of technology, are we constructing a model? Concept does not necessarily mean model. Today, we know that in many human sciences the model is an ideal emergency exit. 13. Constructing a model enables one to have an irresponsible attitude. After describing a certain sociological phenomenon, one can state in case of error that the goal was not to describe a reality, but rather to construct a model to see how that works. However, people forget that if a model is remote from reality, we may see the model working, but its workings will explain nothing. It is exactly like a man who claims he can explain how a painter creates his work. The man takes a puzzle representing a canvas by that painter and starts to piece the puzzle together. He will wind up with the picture, but he will have shown only how a puzzle works and not how an artist paints. Hence, I do not claim to establish a model. I want to give an account of reality, but on a certain level of abstraction. I will approach Max Weber's ideal type, see Gessamelt Aufsätze zur Wissenschaftslehre, 1972, by stressing one or several viewpoints, dwelling on certain phenomena, linking facts that seem isolated in order to achieve a homogeneous whole. It is not a model because I claim that the whole is truly homogeneous, but cannot be seen as such due to epiphenomena, accidents, and at the other end of the scale, the incognito aspect of interrelations. Thus, what I am constructing under the name of concept, then system, may look like a model in that we ask at the outset, is looking at the facts in this way useful for understanding? Rather than, are things really like this? 14. But we will rapidly leave this stage in order to consider not how the model works, but what its problematics are. That is to say, what is questionable about the model in and of itself. At that point, we will integrate the destructive process of the model in order to give an account of reality. And from there, we will go on to question the very fact that serves as the origin of the model. That will establish the critical relationship between the model and reality, and we will avoid both the rhetorical discourse of a philosophical technology and the easiness of setting up a model with no external problematics. In any case, the present concept has the crucial advantage of underlining the specific character of technology and sidestepping the habitual confusions. See Wright Mills quoting Lionel Robbins. For example, the sociological imagination, p. 80, rightly says, "It is not an exaggeration to say that, at the present day, one of the main dangers of civilization arises from the inability of minds trained in the natural sciences to perceive the difference between the economic and the technical. These are confusions between technology and science, between technology and the machine, which we have already abundantly talked about. And then there is the even more frequent confusion between technology and economy. The instant one tries to differentiate them, Marxists accuse one of diversionary maneuvers and anti-revolutionary idealism. And yet, so long as we fail to study the technological phenomenon beyond its economic implications and the problems of the economic system and class struggle, we are doomed to ignorance of contemporary society and hence impotence for any revolutionary action. Economic progress and technization are not synonymous. Technization does not have an economic aspect from the very outset. Today, if there really is a potential and debated kinship between technological and economic growth, there is no kinship whatsoever between technological growth and economic development, as we shall see. A good example of the superficial view of the matter is provided by Rockard, La Crise de la Recherche, Le Monde, May 1970. He keeps mixing up technology with its economic use, especially its capitalist and de Gaullist use. Since discoveries have an economic end, he says, the only question is whether economic growth permits satisfying the aspirations of the entire society or only maximizes the profits of a tiny number. The problems, the real problems, of course, and which I do not contest, are those that radically prevent our discerning the structure of our society and that cause insoluble difficulties. For instance, Rockard feels that the capitalist structure hinders a complete utilization of technological discoveries, but he does not explain why the system manages to work rather well in Japan and West Germany. Thus, the first step in elaborating on the concept of technology is obviously to isolate it from untold connected phenomena that are not in the realm of technology, or else they are at first sight inextricable mixtures of technologies and other factors, political, familial, psychological, ideological, etc. A failure to isolate the concept in order to first consider it in itself will spawn countless mistakes. For example, in the questions we ask ourselves about technology per se. A good catalog of wrong questions on technology, wrong simply for lack of rigor, is supplied by the World Council of Churches in a document summing up the many writings that raise these questions. 15. This document actually lists the problems to be studied. The necessity of an environmental policy, the world food problem, the establishment of national and international structures for a more equitable use of technology, city planning, new problems of the oceans and space, the consequences of genetic and biological progress for controlling and improving life, the creation of new consumer needs, a revolution in producing and storing information, the effects of communications technologies on education and on conditioning public opinion. All these questions, none of which is wrong, are raised with no previous study of technology per se. 16. However, if we study facets of the phenomenon but not the phenomenon itself, we must wind up with mistakes and or platitudes. Remarkably, these experts in a second chapter ask about the politico-economic consequences of technology, without realizing that the first chapter studies only the consequences and not the cause itself. But how can we speak of consequences without first asking, consequences of what? The authors act as if everyone knows a priori what technology is, a brash assumption, which of course results in a lot of shallow work by the World Council of Churches. We have to avoid proceeding along such lines. First, we have to analyze the fact itself, which can be done only if we establish a concept separating technology from its cluster of economico-political factors. However, such a procedure does not imply that technology will hereafter be considered in itself as a self-sufficient entity. That would lead to a further and opposite error. Clearly, one cannot perform an intellectual operation of abstraction and then stop dead. We have to consider things as they are and not carry on about a technology per se, even though that is what countless authors are doing, i.e., describing technology as though man, economy, politics, and society simply did not exist or were still a perfectly malleable clay. Take D. Rorvik, for instance. His unbelievable books, Brave New Baby, 1972, and As Man Becomes Machine, 1971, contain a huge catalog of what certain advanced technologies are bringing about. And once again, we cannot tell from these descriptions whether they bear upon technologies that are already acquired and mastered, or ongoing experiments whose results are not yet known, or a scientist's hopes of success, or a research project, or the conviction that 20 years from now we'll attain something or other. Rorvik presents The Machine Man, the Kybert, the direct link between the brain and the computer, electronic medicine, the generalized use of robots, ESB, electronic stimulation of the brain, which he translates marvelously into electrosex, electromemory, electroeuphoria. ARMS, a cybernetic system allowing the extension of the senses and of work to thousands of miles away. BFT, biofeedback training to separate the mind from matter and liberate the body. Etc. And Rorvik, like A. Toffler, by the way, offers all these things as the reality of technology in the near and sure future. A lab technician does a few experiments like putting 50 electrodes in a guinea pig's brain end that, we are told, is going to be the normal, everyday situation tomorrow. And nobody wonders about the moral and psychological obstacles set up by men, or about the economic difficulties of putting such enterprises to general use, or about the political and sociological problems involved. Everything happens as in a dream world. The great wizard discovers a new technology, his magic wand touches reality, and presto, everything is transformed. To be precise, I am not passing judgment on any particular technology. I am simply trying to point out that there is a world of difference between the laboratory discovery of a technology and its universal application. All sorts of discoveries have seemed possible at a given moment, and yet ultimately they did not materialize. Bear in mind all the density of reality. It is not the dangers in the growth of those technologies that frighten me, but rather the childishness of the authors who believe that these technologies are already here and that tomorrow's world is today's laboratory. To speak of a machine that lives and thinks, or even reproduces itself, is infantile anthropocentrism. Von Neumann. Jean-Claude Bonne declares that the machine has a super-rationality, testifying to the strength of a creative thought of its own norms, founded on a new world full of noise and senses. But that is pure phantasmagoria. Again, this is precisely a focus on aspects of technology, mainly computers, and Bonne is pushing them to an extreme as if they were the reality. But technology is inevitably part of a world that is not inert. It can develop only in relation to that world. No technology, however autonomous it may be, can develop outside a given economic, political, intellectual context. And if these conditions are not present, then technology will be abortive. Once again, the magicians who tout the machine as the perfect substitute for man, as thinking so much better than man because it can think outside the tumult of passions, Bonne, are lapsing into the same error. They are considering an aspect, one facet of the technological phenomenon, but not the technological phenomenon itself. Only by knowing this phenomenon in its totality can one measure both its newness and its limits. Obviously, if we picture plural technologies next to one another, then we can always imagine their indefinite development. But if we study a system in which the technologies correlate to one another, and we perceive that the system is not closed, then we also have to realize that we can neither anthropologize the technologies nor imagine their indefinite development. That is why we have to start by conceptualizing technology and flatly rejecting the hyperbolic and phantasmagorical depictions of tomorrow's society, a la Goddard's Alphaville. This is a mythological picture of civilization, which is not about to, and indeed never will, come true. Like 2001, it is as alien as it is both horrible and perfectly reassuring. An author constructs a monstrous and imaginary vision of the world to come, and then he attacks it, which he can do with impunity, since it does not correspond to any social structure or any group. This also plays a part in the development of the system, as we shall see further on, but it is downright false in regard to technology. And whether the mistake is due to overgenerosity, as in Rorvik, or to horror, it comes down to the same thing. This is not technology, this is not the world of tomorrow. Ferreting out a concept of technology allows a precise measure of its possibilities by establishing its totality, and by placing the technological phenomenon in relation to the context in which it develops. On the other front, it allows us to assert the autonomy of technology and prevents us from falling victim to the equally simplistic optimism of a Charles Reich, The Greening of America, 1970, who sees everything as occurring solely on the level of consciousness. To control technology, it suffices to take hold of controls that no one is holding. We have to fill a void, put an intelligence where none exists. It's that simple. Once again, a touch of the magic wand, but instead of the explosion of the universal use of advanced technologies, we have a miraculous control by a simple awareness of the entire system. Technology itself produces consciousness I, which is that of man as a free and spiritual adult. Hippies everywhere. It suffices if the system of values changes, if psychological behavior is transformed, if the way of life is transformed, and poof, technology has no more power. The triumph of long hair and bell-bottoms, proclaims Reich, guarantees our mastership of technology. For the choice of a lifestyle is an act of transcendence of the machine, an act of independence, a declaration of independence. We are entering a new age of man. Watch out on the right, watch out on the left. Of course, Rorvik is correct when he underlines the enormous growth of technological potentials and the prodigious gamut of possible uses. But he is wrong when he believes that technology develops within the perfect void of a closed balloon. Reich is correct when he, conversely, emphasizes that nothing can be done without consciousness, and that consciousness plays a preponderant role in fashioning the society. But he is wrong when he believes that a change in consciousness is in itself the transformation of the technological system. One man dreams of the perfect malleability of man and society, the other of the perfect malleability of technology. Conceptualizing ought to help us avoid both mistakes. By its intellectual rigor, the concept will prohibit us from going off course. Far from removing us from reality, its very abstraction, if the work is done right, will allow us to take account of all reality and prevent us from forgetting any of the correlations in which the concept is located. Thus, our primary work does not consist in dillying in the field of possibilities, culling an iris here, a heart transplant there, or a lily of the field, a thinking computer. We have to come up with a system that takes into account different elements as well as there being factors of the realities that condition and are conditioned. By working out a concept, we have to grasp things as they are and not be swept away uncritically into any random direction in which our hearts happen to carry us. Under these conditions, we are absolutely have to establish the difference between the concept of technique and the concept of technology. It is a grave error, often made by French intellectuals imitating Anglo-American usage, to speak of technology when they really mean technique. The former is a discourse on technique, a science of technique. First of all, it is a discourse on different techniques, English, technologies. Then an attempt at discoursing on technique, English, technology in general, i.e., actually on the concept itself. This, however, is not intended as a study of the procedures of, some say, industrial operation. That would be the subject of technical courses. The goal here is a philosophical reflection. Now the latter is actually uncertain only so long as we do not start by determining the very concept of technique, English, technology, and the system technician, the technological system. At this point, the logos becomes a kind of abstract dissertation without references. It is all the more interesting in that, according to the customary mania of philosophers, this is a discourse on technique, English, technology per se. In any era, in any environment, as though it were possible to identify Western technique, English, technology, before the 18th century with present-day technique, English, technology. Simondon directly tackles the technological phenomenon itself, and in these terms he does good work rather than producing a chimerical discourse. In contrast, we have a fine example of empty discourse, using the Anglicism technology, in Bohn's book La Technologie, 1972. This effort is adorned with all the pompous rhetoric of structuralism, post-Marxism, and modern linguistics in order to sound deep. It supplies 4 or 5 definitions of technology without avoiding the simplistic pitfalls. The machine lives and thinks, or the most elementary confusions. We cannot judge the technological phenomena because the object is indifferent to the phantasms that we bring to bear upon it, etc. This is an utterly naive labor, which is given a scientific appearance by the rhetorical system. As such, it is quite technological, a simple discourse about nothing that has been clearly conceptualized. In this English version of Ellul's book, the translator, with the author's permission, has gone along with American usage by rendering the French technique as technology, JN.